Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 2, halacha 4. And over in chapter 2, halacha 3, we were talking about jumbling up the letters when we write the letters, when we compose the letters. Now, the natural thing is going to be what happens when we're not saying these things right. What's going to happen? Did we do the mitzvah or did we not do the mitzvah? So the Mishnah is going to get into where saying something is extra critical. The Mishnahs are extra precise. And what is the mitzvah that is most connected with speech in the Jewish religion? It's saying the Shema. And the Shema has to be said in a certain way because you're required to say it twice a day. And it's the thing that, well, what if it's said in a blemished way? Did you actually end up saying it? So that's why this is choosing not just some other prayer, it's choosing the Shema. And we should realize that really the precision of what Rebbe did when he organized it. It's beautiful. The more you look at the Mishnah, the more you just see precision in the universe. Anyway, the Mishnah starts and says, one who recites the Shema without making it audible to his ear has nevertheless discharged his obligation. And Rabbi Yossi says he has not discharged his obligation. Now, this is a very curious line because Rabbi Yossi is normally going to be, the Tana Rabbi Yossi is normally going to be the Halacha, except we have an anonymous one here. And so what's going on here is that when you have an anonymous one, you have that one being the halacha, not Rabbi Yossi. So very interesting that the Tanna Kama is explaining the phrase to mean that, one may recite the Shema, and over here, and by the way, you can say that in any language, but the key is that you have to hear it. You have to understand it. You have to hear it. And over here, we have this this thing about what's going to be happening because who gave this anonymous Mishnah? Could it have been Rebbe, or it could have been from Rabbi Meir. And in both cases, if you have Rabbi Yudah versus Rabbi Yossi, it's going to follow Rabbi Yossi, and definitely if you have Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, it's going to follow Rabbi Yossi. And so it's interesting that this part here is contrasting it with Rabbi Yossi. So basically, what this is saying is that that the Tanna Kama is basically stating that somebody who recited the Shema, even though you can't hear it, he did the obligation, and that basically the recitation is going to be valid after the fact. All right, and but I mean, obviously the case is that it should be audible, right? And this is basically rejecting Rabbi Yossi's interpretation about audibility. That Rabbi Yossi saying that that this part of the Shema does have to be audible. The Mishnah continues, says, if one recited the Shema and he was not meticulous in enunciating the letters, Rabbi Yossi says he has nevertheless discharged the obligation, and Rabbi Yudah says he has not discharged the obligation. So the Pnei Moshe says about this that even according to Rabbi Yossi, he has merely discharged the obligation after the fact, and initially one must really enunciate the entire Shema meticulously with a lot of attention to detail, effectively. And then the next part says that one who recites the Shema out of sequence has not discharged the obligation. And the Mishnah says if one recited the Shema and he made a mistake, he erred, and he must return to the place where he erred. So the question is going to be, if he skipped a word or a verse, is it going to be where he has to return to the verse where he admitted, or does he actually have to go back to the verse that where he admitted the word? So that's going to be basically the question. So if he said something out of sequence, do you have to go back to the point that's out of sequence, or do you have to start that passage over again? So that is going to be a question, and that's what we're going to get into. So the Gemara is gonna talk about whether this inaudible expression of the Shema does end up fulfilling the obligation or not. So Rav said the halacha follows the opinions of both of them. It follows, in other words, what he's saying is that it follows Rabbi Yossi and also whoever is in this anonymous Mishnah to be lenient. So the Pnei Moshe says about this that in the Mishnah's first clause, the halacha follows the Tanakama, who validates an inaudible Shema recitation, and in the second clause, the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi, who validates an unmeticulous enunciation of the recital. So the Gemara is going to wonder about the necessity of this ruling. In other words, what Rav is saying is that it follows the Tanakama, where it says in the Mishnah, one who recites the Shema without making it audible to his ear has discharged the obligation. And what Rav is saying is that don't look at where Rabbi Yossi says that about it not being loud enough that he's not discharged the obligation. It says, look at the next part of the Mishnah where it says that if one recited the Shema and was not meticulous in the enunciation of the letters, Rabbi Yossi says he has discharged the obligation. So, in other words, what he's saying is that the first part of the anonymous Mishnah is what it is, and in the second part, it's going to be by Rabbi Yossi. But that's curious because everybody knows that if you have a disagreement, like in the second part between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yudah, the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. So what's going on there? There's something here, and we're going to get into that. So the Gemara now is wondering, why is this ruling even necessary? And the Gemara says that, now had Rav not stated this, what else would we have said? In other words, what this is saying is that when you have a dispute between anonymous Tana and Rabbi Yossi, we know that, says the Gemara, the general rule is that the halacha follows the anonymous Tana. And that's a basic rule in trying to learn Mishnayot. The basic rule is that whenever you have an anonymous ruling in the Mishnah, and then you have any kind of dissent, the anonymous Mishnah is going to be authoritative. And the anonymous ruling followed by dissent, when you have an anonymous ruling that ends up being followed by dissent, the halacha does not automatically follow the anonymous opinion in that case. So in one case where you have a ruling recorded anonymously, and then there's not necessarily a dissent, that ruling is going to be authoritative. But what happens when you have an anonymous ruling and then you have a dissent after it? Not always does it follow the anonymous opinion. So the question is that, if the anonymous opinion is going to be considered to be the majority opinion, then that's going to be a question about, whether there's a compelling reason to overturn it. And that's going to be really a big question about it. But one of the ideas here is that whenever you have a dispute between these Tanaim specifically, Rabbi Yudah and Rabbi Yossi, halacha goes by Rabbi Yossi. And by the way, whenever you have a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, halacha goes by Rabbi Yossi. That's just basically how it works. So basically, they're trying to explain and understand what's happening here, because you have an anonymous Tana here, who then applies this rule or principle, and then you have a dissent. not just a descent, but a descent from Rabbi Yossi. So how should we be interpreting this? So the Gemara says that with respect to the second dispute in the Mishnah, that's going to be the second clause there, which is a dispute between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yudah. The Gemara says the general rule is that the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. In other words, what they're saying is that automatically it's obvious that the lenient view of Rabbi Yossi is going to be what it is. So the Gemara says, why then did Rav need to say that the halacha follows both of them to be lenient? That's really the $1 million question here. So how are we supposed to understand this? Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say that, indeed, according to our reading of the Mishnah, Rav's statement would not be necessary. However, since Rav heard Rabbi Chia teach it, that's going to be the lenient opinion of the Mishnah in the second clause, in the name of Rabbi Meir rather than Rabbi Yossi. And when you have disputes, basically, as we just said, between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yudah, the general rule is that the halacha follows Rabbi Yudah. So if we applied the general rule to this Mishnah, you could have come up with the second clause having the halacha following the more strict rule of Rabbi Yudah. Gemara says that, therefore, it was necessary for Rav to state the halacha follows the opinions of both of them to be lenient. In other words, what the Haredim says about this is Rav is teaching that the halacha follows the lenient opinion, so that whether one reads Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Meir in the later clause, he will know that that opinion prevails. So you could have read that anonymous Mishnah as being Rabbi Meir, and so then what could have happened is, because Rabbi Chia was teaching that lenient opinion not in the name of Rabbi Yossi, but actually in the name of Rabbi Meir, so it could have created a confusion. And then instead of saying that, because you look, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yudah goes by Rabbi Yudah, it would have been the more strict view. And so since the Mishnah is recording it as Rabbi Yossi, and instead of Rabbi Meir, even though Rabbi Meir was also teaching it that way, you would have ended up with a different ruling on it. In other words, that's not the tradition. The tradition is what Rabbi Yossi and what Rabbi Meir was saying, not what Rabbi Yudah was saying on it. So the Gemara now is going to get into this connection of the Mishnah's distinction, whether you have an inaudible recitation of the Shema, and whether that's going to be valid. So the Gemara says that it was taught in a Brisa, one who prayed the Shemona Esrei without making it audible to his ear has discharged his obligation. Now, the Gemara wants to go over this ruling. So according to whom is this ruling necessary? According to Rabbi Yossi. The Gemara is going to explain and say, the Gemara says, to which statement does Rabbi Yossi refer? It says, to that which we learned in our Mishnah. One who recites the Shema without making it audible to his ears has, nevertheless, discharged his obligation. But Rabbi Yossi says he has not discharged the obligation. So what's going on here? So this Bryce is teaching that Rabbi Yossi states specifically in regards to the Shema. Why would it be saying with regards to the Shema? Because the Torah itself has a special status for hearing the Shema. That's why. But regarding Shemona Esrei, he also agrees, Rabbi Yossi also agrees that if it wasn't said loudly enough that you could hear it, he still has discharged the obligation. Why would that be? Because in the Shema, you have to hear. And if it was inaudible, you didn't do it, says Rabbi Yossi. And that kind of stipulation does not apply to the Shemona Esrei. There's no such verse that makes it so that Shemona Esrei has to be audible. So that's why he's holding that. So the Gemara is going to say that there's a Mishnah in Tractate Megillah, chapter 2, 5, and it's going to read that all are qualified to read the Megillah except for one who is deaf, a deranged person, or a minor. And the Gemara comments on how that Mishnah relates to the Tanaic dispute in our Mishnah concerning an inaudible recitation of the Shema. So Rav Masna said this Mishnah's disqualification of a deaf person for the Megillah's reading is reflective of the opinion of Rabbi Yosei in our Mishnah. In other words, what this is teaching that, just as Rabbi Yosei is going to invalidate the Shema that was not loud enough for a person's ear to hear, so too he would also invalidate over there the Megillah, which is not audible enough to hear. And we know that the Megillah also has this thing that you're supposed to hear the Megillah. So, what's going on with this? So Rabbi Yosei said, this, by the way, is now going to be the Amar Rabbi Yosei. This is not the Tana Rabbi Yosei. This is the Amar Rabbi Yosei, who's going to be talking about the Tana Rabbi Yosei. So that happens a lot. But anyway, this is what it is. So Rabbi Yosei, this is the Amarah, said, we originally thought to say that in regard to what case do the rabbis and Rabbi Yosei disagree? In other words, where does Rabbi Yosei maintain that a recital which is inaudible to the ears is actually going to be invalid? And the Gemara says that in regard to the Shema, for regarding the Shema, it is written, "Hear, O Israel." And Rabbi Yosei basically is understanding this to teach that part of this mitzvah is that the recital has to be heard by the person who's saying it, because the Torah says to hear. So the Gemara continues and says, but in regard to all the other mitzvahs where the Torah does not state here, Gemara says they do not disagree. And even, by the way, the point is that Rabbi Yosei also is conceding that a recitation of something like the Shemona Esrei, which is inaudible to a person's ear, is going to be valid. So the Gemara says, now, however, that Rabbi Masna has said that the Mishnah also disqualifies a deaf person from the Megillah reading is reflective of Rabbi Yossi's opinion, for Rabbi Yossi holds that since the person cannot hear his own reading, it's invalid. You can conclude that the same rule which Rabbi Yossi stated regarding the Shema pertains to all the other mitzvahs as well. In other words, what this is saying is that the word Shema, which is here, is specifically there in the context of the Shema. And now, Rabbi Yossi's idea for extending the stipulation of audibility to other contexts is going to get explored. So, Gemara says, what is the basis for the opinion of Rabbi Yossi that an inaudible recitation is invalid in every context? It is the verse, and you shall hearken to his mitzvot. In other words, that's in Exodus in 15:26, and basically this is trying to teach to all mitzvos. And the Gemara says, let your ears hear what your mouth expresses. In other words, that, and by the way, the Bavli is going to give another scriptural source for the notion of inaudibility to be a disqualification in all areas of the Torah, but nonetheless, the Yerushalmi is pulling from Devarim 27:9 to say to be attentive and to hear, and and it says, "O Israel," so that basically what the Yerushalmi is saying is that this is really the scriptural source for making sure that your prayers are going to be audible. The Bavli, by the way, is using this verse elsewhere to be for Torah study. So a little bit of disagreement there between Bavli and Yerushalmi. But the point here is that, the Mishnah, which, does disqualify a deaf person over there in Megillah from the Megillah reading itself, is going to follow Rabbi Yosei, and the Gemara now gets into a different analysis of the Mishnah. So Rabbi Chizda said, in a correct reading of the Mishnah, the term one who is deaf is not included here among those who are disqualified from reading the Megillah. And basically, the Gemara continues and says, it is due to the flow of speech that some, erroneously inserted that term in the Mishnah. So basically, what this is saying is that throughout the Talmud, the deaf person is commonly going to be listed together with a minor or a mentally ill person. And what this is trying to say, says the Haredim, is that the students in the Mishnah made a mistake and inserted the term for the deaf person here. It shouldn't have been put in there. That's basically what this is saying. In other words, this is saying that the Mishnah should just be talking about the minor and the deranged person about this. So that's basically going to be what this is. But regarding the Tana Rabbi Yosei, according to Rabbi Hizda, Rabbi Yosei is going to invalidate an inaudible recitation only in the case of the Shema, where the Torah is going to state specifically to hear, O Israel. And Rabbi Hizda is going to question about what if somebody's deaf, and basically he's saying that it was inserted in the Mishnah erroneously, and that if the Mishnah and the Megillah does disqualify a deaf person from the Megillah reading, because it would follow Rabbi Yosei and extend this stipulation to other areas of Torah law, then it would constitute an anonymous Mishnah in accordance with Rabbi Yossi's strict view. So that's something that's interesting. But anyway, we're going to get into tomorrow about other aspects of audibility in order to discharge and dispatch an obligation. One of the things about that is going to be in Trumos, because you have to say the clause, the prayer in Trumos, and a deaf person is not really supposed to be separating. Not supposed to be separating. If a deaf person does separate truma, it's going to be valid after the fact, but it's not really the right way to do it. So we're going to get into a lot of things about actually saying and uttering your speech, and why would that be? Why would that be important? Because Hashem created all of the worlds in the universe with speech, and that was audible. We see the effects of that today. And so when we're standing in front of Hashem, we should make our prayers audible, because we're supposed to emulate Hashem, and Hashem made it audible. We can see that today, and we also should try to copy that as well.